Um, Great. So, good evening. Um, I am excited to talk to you tonight about Rosh Hashanah as Yom Hadin, the Day of Judgment, and why we're all so terrified of being judged by God. And so, the exact nature of Rosh Hashanah is a bit complex, in part because we are just not really sure how we're supposed to feel about judgment more broadly, about Rosh Hashanah. And so I grew up thinking, Rosh Hashanah was a happy day. It's the new year, and Yom Kippur is scary because that's when our judgment is sealed. In recent years, I've thought more about how maybe Rosh Hashanah is a bit more daunting because it's the beginning of our judgment, whereas Yom Kippur is a happy day because we know God will forgive us, of course, as long as we put in the requisite work as well. But I actually want to question this view as well because I want to push back against the idea that judgment is inherently negative, that the judgment we face on Rosh Hashanah can actually be a positive. And so we'll look at some Gemara, some Rishonim, and modern sources to better understand this question about Rosh Hashanah and what we should be thinking about while we are being judged by God in this season. So I start the source sheet off with a quote from Martin Buber in an essay he wrote about Franz Kafka and Judaism. And he quotes this really beautiful midrash that, I found the midrash. He writes about it much more beautifully, I think, than the midrash itself sounds. And so I decided to include the way he describes it and then his commentary on it as well. And so he writes that in Kafka's novel, The Castle, a broad meaninglessness governs without restraint. Every notice, every transaction is shot through with meaninglessness, and yet the legality of the government is unquestioned. Man is called into this world, he is appointed in it, but wherever he turns to fulfill his calling, he comes up against the thick vapors of a midst of absurdity. The world is handed over to a maze of intermediate beings. We are reminded of the Haggadic account in Agadat Bereshit of the sinful David who prays to God that God himself may judge David and not give him into the hands of the seraphim and the Kruvim, for they are cruel. So this, I think, is a really beautiful framing for what we're going to talk about, and we're going to revisit some of these themes throughout and especially the relationship with Kafka as well. So let's first look at some classic sources about Rosh Hashanah itself. So the Bavli discusses the question of why we don't say Hallel on Rosh Hashanah. It interestingly frames it as a conversation between the Malachei HaSharet, the ministering angels, and God. And so we can see in the Gemara, Michlal Diva Rosh Hashanah, like a Hallel. There's no Hallel in Rosh Hashanah. My taima, what's the reason? Amar Rabbi Abahu, Amru Malachei HaSharet, Lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the angels said before God, Ribono Shel Olam, Mipnei Ma Ein Yisrael Omrim Shira Lefanacha B'Rosh Hashanah V'Yom HaKippurim. God, what is the reason that Yisrael doesn't sing songs of praise, as in Hallel, before you on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? Amar lahem, efshar melech yoshev al kisei din, v'sifrei chayim, v'sifrei metim, ketuchim lefanav, v'Yisrael omrim shira. Is it possible, God responds to the angels, is it possible that the king is sitting on the throne of judgment and the books of life and the books of death are open before him, and the Jewish people are reciting joyous songs of praise? And so we see, and you can see in the English, I believe, Rav Steinsaltz's commentary interspersed. He says explicitly, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are somber days of judgment whose mood is incompatible with the recitation of Hallel. And so it's actually so obvious to God that, of course, Israel would not be singing Hallel on these days, that he actually frames it as a rhetorical question. how could Bnei Israel possibly sing today? We're dealing with life and death here. This is a real question for us. And so just a little side note, I think it's interesting that it's perhaps the angels themselves who ask this question, because it's so obvious for humans we are the ones standing in judgment. And so of course we're filled with fear and with awe. Like, of course we can't sing Hallel. But so it takes the angels to ask that question. But if we look in the third source, we can see the Yerushalmi provides a different perspective on Rosh Hashanah, one that might feel a little less familiar to us. And so we have the name of either Rabbi Chama, Rabbi Chanina, or Rabbi Hoshaya. One of them says, Ezo umak umah hazot. Is there a people like this people? ונוהג שבעולם אדם יודע שיש לו דין לובש שחורים ומתעטף שחורים ומגדל זקנו. So other nations of the world, when they know that they are about to stand in judgment, they dress in black and they wrap their head in black and he lets his beard grow. שאינו יודע איך דינו יוצא. So because he doesn't know how the judgment is going to turn out. Aval Yisrael eino kain. Yisrael is not like this. Ela lovshim levanim umitachvin levanim umelgalchin zikenam ve'ochlin ve'shotim ve'snechin. Israel is not like this. What is it that we do? We wear white and we wrap our heads in white and we grow out our beards, so to speak, and we eat and drink and we're happy. And so why is this? Yod'in sha'kadosh baruch hu oseh lahem nisim, because we know that God will do miracles or wonders for us. And so here in the Yerushalmi, we see a more positive view of the Yamim Noraim, rather than acting like mourners, dressing in black and letting the beards grow. They're fearful of the outcome of judgment. Here, Israel, we know God will do miracles for us. And so I do think this idea is really beautiful. It does present other problems, that we're not going to get into, but, it does present the issue, like, if we're confident we'll be forgiven, is this real judgment then in some way? But that's a whole other sheer. But what's important to note is that in this source, we're excited, we're happy, we know that God will do wonders for us, but the happiness comes from the fact that we know we will be forgiven, which is through the miracle of God, not because judgment is necessarily a positive thing. And so it sidelines, I think, the question of judgment entirely, which is what I want to be focusing on with Rosh Hashanah. If you are not actually worried about the judgment, then it's not really a problem in the same way. And so I want to look now at some sources that maybe make a bit clearer this ambiguous nature of Rosh Hashanah, because the nature of judgment itself isn't so clear. And so our next source, number 4, is also from the Babli and Rosh Hashanah. It opens with the classic Mishnah, the Arba'a Prakim Ha'olam Nidon, that 4 times a year the world is judged. On Pesach, Al HaTevuah, Ba'atzeret, Al HaPeirot, Ha'ilan. Rosh Hashanah, Kol Ba'ei Olam Ovrim Lefanav Kivnei Maron. On Rosh Hashanah, all creatures pass before God, Kivnei Maron, which this translation chooses like sheep, which is one of the interpretations. There are 2 other interpretations proposed in the Gemara of what Kivnei Maron means. It's not quite clear, but either way, we all pass before God in judgment. And so the Gemara then cites a Breita, which includes 3 other opinions about when we are judged. And so the Gemara says, Tanya, it's taught in a Breita, Hakol nidonim b'Rosh Hashanah, u'gzar din shelahem nechtam b'Yom HaKippurim, divrei Rabbi Meir. So all are judged on Rosh Hashanah, and their sentence is sealed on Yom Kippur, This is what Rabbi Meir says. And so that's the conventional view. That's the view that most of us have. Also, it's what we say in our liturgy as well, multiple times on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And so that's kind of the conventional view. This next part, Rabbi Yehuda expands on Rabbi Meir's view, including the other parts of creation we saw in this Mishnah, but he ultimately does agree with Rabbi Meir that our judgment is sealed on Yom Kippur. And so he's just kind of offering more of an expansion of Rabbi Meir's view. The other two views are at the bottom of the source of Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Natan. And so Rabbi Yossi Omer, Adam nidon b'chol yom shenemar batikva deinu livkarim. So, okay, sorry, I thought I froze. Rabbi Yossi says a person is judged every day. As it says in Sefer Eov, in the book of Job, you visit him every morning. Rabbi Natan Omer, Adam nidon b'kol sha'ah, a person is judged every moment, every hour. Shenemar lirgaim tivchaninu. Also from Sefer Eov, you try him at every moment. So we have Rabbi Meir's classic view that a person is judged on Rosh Hashanah and the sentence is sealed on Yom Kippur. Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Natan say we are judged more often than that, either every day or every moment. And so these latter two views do raise the question of why judgment on Rosh Hashanah then matters, because if it's just another moment of judgment that we encounter all the time, it should be no different. The Meiri, who is like a 12th century commentator, says that we're judged on Rosh Hashanah according to our deeds, but in theory we can do tshuva every day, and we should think of it that way. But it's still important to have, of course, one day dedicated to judgment and to doing tshuva and to kind of help us, refocus our deeds. That's a little bit of a tangent, but what I want to focus on in this Gemara is the tone. So Rabbi Yehuda's view and Rabbi Meir, like all of them, kind of make judgment a fact of life. Rabbi Yehuda says it's seasonal. Kol echad ve'echad bismano. Everything is judged in its own time. And then Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Natan make it even more frequent parts of everyday life. It's not just in its own time, it's all the time. And so there might be something this might be overreading a little bit, but I think there's something a little bit somber in their statements, especially given the fact that their proof text is from Sefer Eov, from the book of Job, which is not what we think of as a positive tale of one's relationship with God. It's a very troubling book. And so, do we want to be judged every morning? Maybe it makes the judgment of Rosh Hashanah a little bit less scary, but it creates more seriousness every other day of the year. And I'm not sure whether or not that's necessarily a good or bad thing. It's just, like they say, it's a fact of life. But there's still no clear answer, I think, on whether judgment is necessarily positive or negative. But this Gemara adds an additional valence to it, which is that judgment is a fact of life. They're not questioning that. They're not, bitter about it, it seems. They just are debating how often it happens and like what the implications are for us as people. And so I brought in the next source, mostly because this Ramban, I think, is really beautiful, but it does also add to the ambiguity of Rosh Hashanah, and we'll see why. And so the Ramban, commenting on Vayikra when we're discussing the Chagim, V'hine zeh mevoar ki hakol tolui b'shuva. Everything depends on Shuva. It's clear. Ela v'Rosh Hashanah mityachev l'midat hadin umanhig olamo. But on Rosh Hashanah, Hashem is concerned entirely with the attribute of justice and conducts the world with that attribute. Uva Yom HaKippurim b'midat harachamim. And on Yom Kippur, it's entirely rachamim. V'hu me'amram melch yoshev al kisei din v'chulei, which is the Gemara that we saw. He shows, this is his proof text. It's expressed. The king is sitting on the throne of judgment, and the different books are open before him, etc. And so the Ramban concludes, Rosh Hashanah Yom Din Barachamim, the Yom HaKippurim Yom Rachamim Badin. Thus, Rosh Hashanah is a day of judgment and mercy, and Yom Kippur is a day of mercy and judgment. So both Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur contain elements of Din and Rachamim, but the nature of these days are so different, which we can see in our liturgy as well. We don't mention sin on Rosh Hashanah. We don't say vidui either. And so while the Ramban's drasha is very beautiful, it does leave some ambiguity about the real nature of Rosh Hashanah and why we're so uncomfortable with judgment, even when it is couched in mercy. And so this is kind of further solidified by a machloket about whether we should even say Avinu Malkeinu on Rosh Hashanah, or at least whether we should say the first line, because the first line of Avinu Malkeinu is Avinu Malkeinu chatanu lefanecha, we have sinned before you. And so we can see this machloket. It's not so explicit in the Shulchan Aruch. It's actually in the Beit Yosef, but the Ramah in the Shulchan Aruch is making implicit reference to it, and the Mishnah Berurah spells it out explicitly, and so we can see it without going through the entire Beit Yosef. So in source 6, we see in the Shulchan Aruch, Ein omrim halal b'Rosh Hashanah v'Yom HaKippurim. We've seen that. We don't say Hallel on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, not an appropriate time to be singing. So the Ramah adds, V'nohagin lomar Avinu Malkeinu al haseder. It's our custom, though, to say Avinu Malkeinu in order. He is pushing back. He's saying, we say the first line as well. We say Chatanu lefanecha even on Rosh Hashanah. And so the Mishnah Berurah in the next source is commenting on this and spells out the machloket explicitly. And so on Al HaSeder, Mishnah Berurah says, La'afuke midat harav Beit Yosef shemidalgin bekama mekomot shemaskir chet. So he says the Beit Yosef omits the mention of sin in many places. He doesn't want us to be talking about that on Rosh Hashanah. Validity day, and so according to him, the Beit Yosef, Ein omrim Avinu Malkeinu chatanu lefanecha. We don't say this first line, at least, of Avinu Malkeinu, mipnei she'ein omrim vidui b'Rosh Hashanah, because we don't say vidui on Rosh Hashanah. And kind of in brackets, the Mishnah Berurah gives us the reason, kedei shelo litain pitchon peh lemikat reg, because we don't want to give the accuser, the Satan, perhaps, the opportunity to accuse us. And so here we see this machloket about saying Avinu Malkeinu on Rosh Hashanah because we don't mention sin on Rosh Hashanah. We don't want to give the accuser more opportunity to accuse us and perhaps what we already deserve because we're being judged on Rosh Hashanah. And so I brought in these sources to demonstrate that even on a halachic level, not just a spiritual level or an abstract level, the nature of Rosh Hashanah is not so clear. We're kind of excluding both extremes. We're excluding saying Hallel on Rosh Hashanah because we're being judged, but also we don't say Vidui on Rosh Hashanah, again, because we're being judged. And so we are trying to tread somewhere in the middle. And I think it's because of our, ambivalence towards judgment more generally and our uncertainty about what Rosh Hashanah is really supposed to be about. And so I wanted to spend the bulk of our time in the last few sources, because what we've been through so far is really just setting up the question of what Rosh Hashanah is supposed to look like. And I think understanding the nature of judgment can help us understand what Rosh Hashanah is supposed to look like. So I wanted to look at a source that we don't necessarily think of as typical Rosh Hashanah Torah, but it really helps me understand better the nature of judgment on Rosh Hashanah. So the 10th parak of Masechet Sanhedrin begins with this, infamous statement, Kol Yisrael Yishalhem Chelek Le'olam Haba, a famous statement that all of Yisrael has a portion in the world to come, and then infamously continues by outlining all the exceptions to the rule in the following Mishnayot. And so the third Mishnah in the 10th parak outlines multiple groups who may or may not have a portion in Olam Haba. I did not include the entire Mishnah. It's very long, and we don't need to read each example to be able to understand the point. But the reason that I'm bringing in this Mishnah at all is because it distinguishes between whether a certain group has a chelik in Olam Haba, whether a portion in the world to come, and whether they'll stand in judgment, Omdin Badin. And so we'll read it inside and see exactly what it's talking about. The first example it brings up is Dor HaMabul, the generation of the flood. So it says, Dor HaMabul ein lahem chelik le'olam haba ve'ein omdin badin. Dor HaMabul is not going to receive a portion in the world to come, and will also not stand in judgment. Shene'emar lo yadun ruchi ve'adam le'olam. As it says in Bereshit, my soul shall not abide. But we see yadon, the same shorish as din, in humanity forever. And the Mishnah comments, lo din velo ruach. Neither will they stand in judgment, in din, nor shall their soul, nor velo ruach, which is interpreted to mean nor shall their souls be restored to them. And so the commentators on the Mishnah use this proof text from Bereshit of lo yadun ruchi et be'adam le'olam to explain what exactly standing in judgment means, because on the face of it, it's not so clear. What is the distinction between chelik le'olam haba, omdin badin? Why separate them? It's not exactly clear. There's broad agreement among the Mefarshim that it's about omdin badin being kind of a euphemism or implying it's about mechiyat hametim, that these groups will not experience the resurrection. And so we'll get a bit more into this as after we finish the Mishnah. I just wanted to clarify that is where most of the Mefarshim land on the kind of specific interpretation of what the Mishnah is talking about. I ellipse the next part because they don't make the distinction. They only talk about Olam Haba. And then with the third example, we see this distinction again. So the Mishnah continues, Anshe Sodom, ein lahem chelek le'olam haba. The people of Sodom have no portion in the world to come. Shene'emar ve'anshe Sodom ra'im ve'chata'im la'Hashem me'od. It says explicitly about Anshe Sodom, they were wicked and sinners before God exceedingly. And the Mishnah comments, Ra'im ba'olam hazeh, they are wicked in this world, ve'chata'im le'olam haba, and they are sinners in the world to come. Aval omdin badin, but they will stand in judgment. Rabbi Nehemiah Omer, Elu ve'elu ein omdin badin. Rabbi Nehemiah says both these and these, referring to Anshe Sodom and Dor HaMabul, the generation of the flood. Neither of them will stand in judgment. Shene'emar al kain lo yakumu risha'im b'mishpat v'chata'im ba'adat tzadikim. Proof text from a pasuk in Tehillim, that therefore the wicked shall not stand in judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. And so Rabbi Nehemiah explains, Al kain lo yakumu risha'im b'mishpat zed Dor HaMabul. The first part of this pasuk is referring to Dor HaMabul, the wicked shall not stand in judgment. V'chata'im ba'adat tzadikim, and nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous, Elu Anshe Sodom. So Rabbi Nehemiah makes his argument clear: neither group will be standing in judgment. Amru lo, the sages say to Rabbi Nehemiah, Einam omdim ba'dat tzadikim, aval omdim ba'dat risha'im. They will not stand in judgment in the congregation in the Eidah of the righteous, but they will stand in judgment in the Eidah of the Rishayim, of the wicked. So I mentioned before that this isn't a classic Rosh Hashanah text. I think it's relevant because of this idea of Omdin Badin, of standing in judgment. I think that it seems like these groups are being punished for their actions by not being allowed to stand in judgment. And so, as I said, most of the traditional Mefarshim interpret that to mean that they won't experience Mechayat HaMetim. But the Mishnah uses this phrase of Omdin Badin, and I think that's a deliberate choice. It could have been more explicit in saying, it's about Mechayat HaMetim. And so we see here that without judgment, we can still experience judgment, but the siren, in this judgment, we are all lumped in with the wicked. It's not that these groups will magically escape judgment and therefore everything will be fine. The rabbis say to Rabbi Nehemiah that Dor HaMavel and Anshe Sodom will stand in judgment. It's just that they're with the wicked. And so what initially might seem like a positive, which is escaping judgment, especially if there is reason to be concerned about how we will be judged, it's not actually an escape at all. We will still stand in judgment, and being denied judgment in itself is a kind of punishment. And so the Yerushalmi, interestingly, uses different language. Instead of saying Omdin Badin, it opens Dor HaMavel Ein Lahem Chelek Le'olam Haba. They will not. The generation of the flood does not have a portion in the world to come. And instead, it says Ve'enan Ro'in Le'atid Lavo. They don't see the future, presumably Acharit HaYamim, the end of days, the ultimate future. And so I do think the use of Omdin Badin in the Mishnah is deliberate, because it could have used the same language as the Yerushalmi. And so I originally chose to include the Yerushalmi to show this distinction. Oh, isn't it interesting? They could have just used this instead. They chose not to. But when we read on in the Yerushalmi, it actually illustrates a crucial point about judgment that we don't see as explicitly in the Mishnah or even in the Bavli Sanhedrin so much. And so I just wanted to briefly look at the Yerushalmi inside. So as we read, Dor HaMavel Ein Lahem Chelek Le'olam Haba Ve'enan Ro'in Le'atid Lavo. Ma ta'am, what's the reason? Vayimach et kol haikum ba'olam hazeh vayimach min ha'aretz le'atid lavo. So the Yerushalmi cites this pasuk in Bereshit that God wiped off all that was standing ba'olam hazeh, in this world. They were wiped off from the land, le'olam haba, in the future, in the world to come. And so after a lot of back and forth of different psukim being brought in and being discussed in this context, the Yerushalmi asks a question that we don't really see elsewhere. Vayikablu dinam v'yehei chelek le'olam haba. Why is it that Dor HaMavel and presumably all these other groups that we talk about, why is it that why could they not just receive their punishment, is the translation, but receive dinam, receive their judgment, and then take part in Olam Haba? This seems like a perfectly reasonable, proposal. And so the Gemara responds, Al Shem v'leitz lo shama ge'ara. Because of this pasuk in Mishlei and Proverbs, the scoffer will not hear rebuke. And so the first half of this Gemara is straightforward. We see it in the Mishnah itself, just with the slightly different language of Le'atid Lavo instead of Odin Badin. And so it's the second part to me that's really interesting. The Gemara asks, why can't Dor HaMavel receive their judgment and then enjoy Olam Haba? And the reason is the scoffer will not hear rebuke. So what exactly does that mean? The Korban Haidah, which is one of the few earlier commentators on the Yerushalmi, kind of helps illustrate this point a little more clearly. That is implicit in the Yerushalmi, but kind of takes a little bit to fully flesh out. And so the Korban Haidah explains that Dor HaMavel will not experience Mechiyat HaMeitim, which means instead that their souls are lost entirely. And the reason is that they had ample opportunity to change their ways. The whole point of judgment is to repent, change one's ways, and then a person can merit Mechiyat HaMeitim. But Dor HaMavel had this opportunity when they were alive in Olam Hazeh, and Noach was building the Teva, when he was building the ark. And so the Gemara, the Bavli, actually talks about this explicitly, that Noach would rebuke his generation and try to get them to change, but they refuse. And Rashi brings it in and talks about the whole point. Why did God, make this very inconvenient command for Noach to spend this whole time, many years, building an ark? And what was the point of that? Why couldn't God have just saved Noach and his family? And the reason is that so that the people in the generation will see it and ask questions and be like, hey, Noach, what's going on here? What are you doing? And he could tell them and give them the opportunity to change their ways, and maybe the world would be saved. But instead, they didn't, and they perished in the flood. And so the Yerushalmi is saying that a scoffer will not hear rebuke. This generation already heard the rebuke from Noach and refused to listen in Olam Hazeh, in this world. So why would they listen in Olam Haba? Why would they listen when given a second opportunity? They received their chance. They had many years when Noach was building the ark. And so the Korban Haidah says, Lakach lo nadunu she'ein bahem to'elet. There's no benefit, there's no to'elet to judging them because they're not actually going to change their ways. And so I think what this Yerushalmi is illustrating that's so evocative is that judgment is supposed to lead to change. And that's one of the core messages we receive in the Yamim Noraim. But I think, at least for myself, the way we think about it is that we do tshuva and it leads to positive judgment, and we escape all of these issues entirely. We continue on and everything is okay. But the Yerushalmi is saying that actually judgment could lead to tshuva, and that's one of its values. And so if there is a person or a group of people who have received that opportunity, they've been judged, and they didn't change, then it doesn't make sense to offer them that opportunity again. But the whole point of judgment is to lead to change. And that's one of its real values. And so to tie everything together, I wanted to bring in one last source by Rav Shagar, Rav Shimshon Gershom Rosenberg. He passed fairly young, actually, in his 50s in 2007. He was a rabbi in Israel and founded a yeshiva. And he's generally known for his postmodernist philosophy of Judaism. His work is slowly being translated into English. And the excerpt that I include is from a very recently published collection of drashot for the Chagim. And it's actually just been published by Koren if anyone is interested in reading more. But so Rav Shagar presents our issue very succinctly, the dual nature of Rosh Hashanah, that it's called a Yom Tov, but it's also a time of judgment. And so he uses Kafka to discuss this question, similar to the way that we opened with Martin Buber. So he references Kafka's novel, The Trial, in which a man is accused of a crime about which he is never told and is given very limited, if any, real opportunities to demonstrate his innocence. And included in this novel is a parable that Kafka actually wrote first separately and then wrote The Trial, called Before the Law, where a man from the country seeks admittance to the law, faces a doorkeeper who says, can't allow you in at this moment. And it's very thought-provoking. But so he references these two works. But so let's read Rav Shigar inside. He writes really beautifully, even in translation. The Hebrew is wonderful as well. It was just it's a little less convenient to, put into the source sheet. So Rav Shigar asks, why is Rosh Hashanah called the Yom Tov, a holiday, when it is a day that one Mishnah describes as follows, which we saw at 4 times of the year, the world is judged. On Rosh Hashanah, all creatures pass before God, keep name our own, like sheep. We can answer this question with the aid of Franz Kafka. For Kafka's literary protagonists, such as Joseph K. from The Trial and the man from the country, who are constantly searching for an entrance into the courthouse, their hope is found in the place of law and judgment itself. Why? What is so attractive about the possibility of being judged? The answer is that judgment validates a person. Being judged means a person is not a madman or a child, unfit for judgment. No, he is fit to be judged, and so he seeks out the celebration and happiness of existing. Indeed, this subtle, refined type of celebration disappears from our world as society distances itself from the fundamental idea of judgment. A person today cannot find the doorway to the courthouse. He cannot find hope. Lack of judgment is the Kafkaesque state that characterizes the individual in our modern society. No one judges us, which means no one considers us either. We just exist with no idea of sin or transgression for which we could be judged. Our life is happenstance and frivolity. The gate through which Kafka's protagonist fails to pass is the gate for which we pray on Yom Kippur. Open for us the gate at the time of the closing of the gate when the day is ending, or if it's in Me'ilah, the last tefillah of Yom Kippur. And he concludes, all judgment carries within it the celebratory excitement of the revelation of divine sovereignty. In this sense, judgment is a revelation of holiness, wherein existence receives its value and exits the realm of the mundane. So Rav Shigar has a few great points in here. I wanted to focus specifically on 2. The first is that being judged by God creates meaning and value for us. It is a sign of our relationship with God because, and in fact, what could be worse than being ignored by God? That would be a sign. We can interpret it as God not caring about us. And we are valued because we're noticed and judged by God. And not only that, it gives our actions significance. We're not just wandering aimlessly. What we do on this earth matters, and morality matters, which of course means we're responsible, and that's a good thing. And it also leads to judgment. And so it actually kind of reminds me of the census in Bamidbar in the book of Numbers, where everyone's trying to, all the Mefarshim, all the commentators are trying to figure out like why does God need to do a census? And I believe it's Rashi and the Ramban both have beautiful explanations. And one of them says, it's like God wanting to, God has these precious gems and he wants to count them. And we are like the precious gems for God. And so it's good to be noticed and to be counted. It's what gives us value. And so being judged is a sign that God values us and our actions and cares about us. And so the second point I wanted to try out also ties back to the first source by Buber. And then in the Midrash, he quotes about King David wanting to be judged by God and not by an intermediary. And so he says that he knows God will be more merciful than these intermediaries. And so that might be true. You know, we're not sure, but thankfully we're judged by God and not by the Seraphim. But if God didn't care about us, he would just send the Seraphim to judge us and not worry about it. It's a sign of our relationship that God is actually the one judging us directly. And so it's another way of showing his care for us. And so it's only because of that. It's because God cares for us that he judges us directly. And so both of these facets avoid the meaninglessness of Kafka's world. Part of the issue that Joseph K. faces in the trial is that he only encounters intermediaries. There's no way for him to reach the judge. And as a result, no one can actually give him a straight answer. And so he's left wandering in this kind of meaningless world where, you know, that feels very arbitrary. Here, we're being judged directly by God. We know what code of morality we are being judged by. We know, you know, as well as one can, what, you know, reasonably what God's expectations of us are. And so it's fun. It feels a little bit more transparent in that way. And so with Rosh Hashanah coming up so soon, I just wanted to leave you with the idea that Yom Hadin can still be a Yom Tov, and that it's further evidence of our relationship with God. And so, and ultimately, as Ramban so beautifully says, it's a Yom Din Barachamim. It's a day of judgment in mercy, in part because we are being judged directly by God and not by an intermediary. And as Rav Shigar so beautifully writes, it's what gives our lives value and meaning. And so I want to wish you Kasiva V'Chatima Tova, that we may be inscribed and sealed in the book of life. And if there are any questions or comments, I'd be happy to address them.
Just want to say, I really like this learning. I think I'm going to be sitting in shul because it's a completely different way that I also will think about Rosh Hashanah now.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, no, I'm being very, very honest here. I'm like, oh, sitting and thinking about judgment in a different faceted way is something that really has not occurred to me before. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I think we focus a lot on like the content of the judgment, which is what makes it so terrifying, and
Yeah.
don't always appreciate that like the process itself is important and, you know, can be a
Or that
positive.
judgment in itself is a gift, right? The recognition. Like I feel like this is something as a parent all the time, right? I tell my daughter, like, okay, well, just because you're in trouble doesn't mean that I ever stop loving you, but
Right.
it still means that I want to guide you. And it's kind of it's just another version of the thing that had never occurred to me. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that could be a
Yeah,
whole other like
Yeah.
additional facet is like the parental
Yeah.
element as well. Yeah, sorry,
Hmm.
Miriam.
yeah, no, I was thinking about this, came across similar interpretation of Echa and destruction of the temple, and why there's such a focus in Echa on punishment. That this is, and that was the idea of sense of relationship. That there is actually
Right.
an ongoing relationship between Jewish people and God, and that Dafka that will happen on Tisha B'Av or 17 Tammuz and all of the destruction of the temple, first and the second temple is actually expression of God's involvement rather than God's withdrawal from human reality. So that's, we rather be abused than neglected.
Right. Right.
I would say.
Right, yeah, for better, for worse, you know, with what happens. But yeah, absolutely, that it's a sign of the ongoing relationship, and that's what ultimately gives hope in Eicha. And I love the connection with you know, thinking about the flow from Tisha B'Av through Rosh Hashanah also, and the Yamim Noraim. And so thank you. But yeah, thank you so much.
I love the Kafka reference and the justice aspect of, you know, of the justice can be so I think it's the fear of bureaucracy. So we should not look at the God's intervention in the world or judgment as like soulless ritualistic bureaucracy, rather as you said, parental engagement, what Rahel mentioned beautifully.
Right, yeah, and so that's part of it that with Kafka is that it is this nameless bureaucracy that I didn't include this line from Buber, but he says like the intermediaries in Kafka are not only, you know, anonymous but also stupid, and like uses that phrase. And so the fact that you know, it's this nameless bureaucracy that are the intermediaries is what makes it so terrifying. Whereas, you know, thank God we are in direct relationship with God, and God is not a that would be funny, but it's not God as a bureaucrat or as it's God more like it's Avinu and Malkinu, and so the parental aspect and the king aspect as well. But it's like a king cares about his subjects also. A parent cares about, you know, his or her children, and so it's just a completely different kind of relationship than what we see in Kafka. Kafka is all about alienation anyway, so not a great guide for relationships.
Yeah, you mentioned Buber, so it's just the flip side of I and thou.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Phenomenal. Very, very good. Very fascinating. Thank you for a beautiful presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining. This was really wonderful.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it also. Like I did Kafka reference. It's he's like one of my favorite authors. So.
Oh, wonderful. I've been trying to figure out how to do this, how to work it in, because I've been thinking a lot about Before the Law for a while now, and thinking about its Jewish valences. And so I was like, finally, here's an opportunity for me to be able to talk about it. And so I'm glad I could.
Yeah, no, it fits really well. Yeah, I know I read some of his short stories are really interesting. I can't think of one in particular that connects right now. But yeah, I think the trial fits perfectly. So
yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you very much for this evening, Sarah, and continue to take care of yourself, and hopefully we can have you come and you know, facilitate some learning for us again soon.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Great.
Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Rachel.
Thank you, Rahel. Thank you for doing this.
Bye.
Fantastic.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Oh, yeah. Good night.